Hello, YouTube viewers. Welcome back to another episode of The Siege Captain. In the last episode, we talked about sieges from the dawn of time to 332 BC. We touched on how most sieges were resolved through diplomacy or encircling the city, and in this episode, we're going to specifically focus on direct assaults on a fortified location. So if you want to hear more about an overview of sieges and how they kind of took place and what happened during them, you can watch the last episode. In the last episode, I talked about all the non-fun things of sieges, all the lame tactics that they would try to use to save their troops time and money. But in this episode, we're going to show all the cool things, all the great machines that were built in order to take defensive locations. We're going to look at how these weapons greatly sped up sieges and gave the attackers the edge when it came to sieging. So jumping right into it, we're going to talk about the man, the myth, the legend, Alexander the Great, and how he changed sieges from lasting for years to taking multiple cities in the course of a year. Alexander the Great was standing on the shoulders of giants by the time he started his conquest of the world. Dionysus, the tyrant of Syracuse, spent a dragon's hoard on the research and development of siege weapons. These weapons made their way to Macedon, where Philip II, Alexander's father, used them to unite Greece and the greater Macedonian area to form the biggest state they have ever seen. Philip would create the greatest army on earth at the time. He would also pioneer the use of siege weapons on the battlefield. If you want to learn more about that, you can watch my video here. But with uniting Greece, creating the best army in the world at the time, and pioneering the use of siege weapons on the battlefield, Philip II would do the modern-day equivalent of gifting his son a billion-dollar tech company. But with all the vigor of youth, Alexander the Great could use this to conquer the known world. So going into his conquest of the known world, here are some specifics on how he changed siege warfare. One of the biggest hurdles in siege warfare was getting up to the walls. Oftentimes, defenders had built giant trenches around their city. The first thing Alexander the Great did was design an armored shed. He would use this armored shed to fill up trenches. Sometimes it would take days, other times it would take months of piling up dirt to allow his weapons to advance up to the walls. So a commonality for a lot of siege weapons on the field, including these armored sheds, were how they were armored. They would fill bags with whatever medium that could cushion blows, and they would put these bags on the sheds or on any siege weapon that was advancing up to the walls. See, these bags would act as pillows, cushioning the blows from the rocks dropped off the walls. They also were filled with fire-resistant material like wool or wet seaweed to stop the fire from spreading. These bags would be put on any siege weapon that was going to get close to the walls or in the range of fire arrows. They were literally living the childhood dream of a rolling pillow fort. You and the boys inside your rolling pillow fort, and you get to dig holes. That's every child's dream. So with this cushioning and armor in mind, and also the trench is filled, what are you going to use all this for? A battering ram, of course. These mainstays would be used in siege warfare from the dawn of time until cannons kind of made them obsolete. So you would armor plate your ram and roll up right up to the wall where you filled in the trench and start ramming into their walls. This would cause the defenders themselves to lower down a pillow in front of your ram to try to cushion the blows. If you had told me that pillows could be used defensively and offensively in siege warfare to great effect, I would never believe you. But the more research I do, the more I see how much they actually were used. So rams would only be effective if the walls were thin enough to actually be toppled over, or if you could get up to the gate. But the defenders knew this, so they would protect their gates with a lot more archers and covering fire, not allowing your rams to get up to the walls. The problem in siege warfare is the other side is always doing something. It's like chess. You make a great move, then your opponent does something to undo that. It's quite annoying. An issue would arise even if you did destroy the walls. Because if the walls crumble over, it's still the big pile of rocks. It's not very easy to get over those. It's a misnomer in siege warfare that your goal was to destroy the wall and go through the breach every single time. It was a lot easier to just go on top of the walls. That's where siege towers come into play. Now, siege towers have been around in sieges basically forever, but Alexander the Great would take it to the next level. This was around the time where math was becoming kind of popular, so a bunch of nerds actually learned how to build things. Alexander the Great would have specialized engineers come to the siege, and they would use some rough calculations to measure the height of the walls so that their siege towers were custom tailored to the size of the walls they were sieging. This would allow the siege towers to open their little drawbridges and let the troops perfectly level onto the defenders' walls. Alexander the Great would build the equivalent of a luxury car of siege towers. Also, the size of these siege towers is quite flabbergasting. There's stories of siege towers being over 150 feet tall. These siege towers would get individual names, kind of like battleships would in later wars, and the base of them could be up to 50 feet by 60 feet wide. Moving these suckers took an army of their own. There's still some debate on how they actually move them. The most agreed upon method to move these were big long rods sticking out the back of the siege towers. You would just strap oxen and people to it and push them at a very slow rate. Oftentimes, thousands of men were needed to push these towers. A more speculative means of how they would get these towers to move was they would advance in their armored sheds in front of the siege tower and pound stakes into the ground and put pulleys on them, and then run a rope around those pulleys underneath the siege tower. So the rope would be attached to the front of the siege tower, go around the pulleys where the stake is, and come back underneath it where they could pull on the ropes, thus putting the force on the front of the siege tower. And they would pull it up to those stakes, then they would put in more stakes, and advance that way. But we honestly don't know how they did it, and maybe they just used multiple methods. Another really interesting fact on how siege towers move was the wheels would be set in a straight line so the tower could move forward. But if you needed to turn the tower, you needed to pick it up, rotate the wheels 90 degrees so that you could move that direction. It was like moving your rook in chess. You can move straight or sideways. Another speculation is that they could have built in varying degrees on the corners of a siege tower. You could put your wheels in this way or rotate them 15 degrees this way or 15 degrees this way, but there's no proof of that actually happening. This here is an artist's rendition of how siege towers could have looked. He's kind of discredited for this picture because you can see the marble pillars he put in it for decoration. This time period was also the dawn of the catapult. Now, a catapult isn't just a little one-armed stone thrower. I have a whole video on the history of the catapult. I recommend you go watch that. But catapult was a term of just any machine that hurled something downrange. Alexander the Great would put catapults, they're mainly ballista, in his siege towers. So when he was advancing on the walls, he basically had the ancient sniper rifles of the time to shoot the defenders that were trying to stop the siege tower from advancing. The defense had many ways to try to counter siege towers. A very common way was throw rocks in front of it. If you threw a big enough rock, it would take quite a few men to move that rock out of the way of the siege tower. These siege towers didn't have suspension, so they couldn't get over rocks very well. So if you threw a big rock in the way of the tower, now you need to get a bunch of men to go pick up the rock, which they can be accosted by missile fire from the walls. Another common method was to flood the field in front of the siege tower so it would get stuck in mud. Mud is one of the greatest forces to be reckoned with. Modern equipment today still gets stuck in mud. The modern tank that costs millions, if not billions of dollars to produce still is beaten by mud. So the defenders could pour water in front of the siege tower in hopes that it would get stuck in the mud. Another great way to stop a siege tower was just to shoot the people who were pushing or pulling the siege tower, because they were oftentimes not armored or just cattle. If an ox gets hit by an arrow, you don't want to be near that ox anymore. That ox is going to go crazy and start stampeding anything in its path. Another more comical way they would stop siege towers is before the attackers were ever there, they went out into the field and they would bury large clay supports or wood supports in the ground, and you would make a pitfall that was strong enough for people to stand on. But these siege towers weighed tons and tons, so the people could stand on it and think it's just normal ground, but when the siege tower rolled over it, it would collapse down, knocking over the siege tower and destroying it. It's like Jesse and James Team Rocket stuff, but it actually worked. That just required foresight, and foresight's kind of difficult in sieges. Going back to talking about the catapult, catapults were not used to destroy fortifications. They were used to kill the defenders, or if you could fling rocks over the walls to try to demoralize the town from being bombarded. Civilians want to surrender really quickly when they're being killed randomly by falling rocks. There are cases of catapults being used to destroy defenses. It just wasn't very common because walls are a lot easier to build than powerful siege weapons. So going back to talking about catapults, there was basically two types of catapults. One that would throw stones, and one that would shoot large arrows or bolts, whatever you want to call them. Either way, these were not used to destroy the fortifications. They were used to kill people. It's interesting because the ancient writers talking about siege weapons talk about how it was preferred to have a flat trajectory at the sacrifice of range. because it would make them easier to aim, thus a lot more effective at hitting their target. But some people argue that range would be a lot more important for these siege weapons, but the evidence shows that the ancients preferred their siege weapons to shoot straight and as flat as possible, even if it meant they would lose a little range. An example of this was people thought, having catapults up on walls would increase their range, and also if you could increase your range even further with like an arc in your shot rather than flat, you could ward people off from further away. This wouldn't work because if you're sieging a town, you could just move your camp so that you're not in range of the siege weapons. So then when the siege actually does happen, you want to be able to aim as accurately as possible to kill the people who are sieging your town. Because as a siege tower is rolling up, they're going to have a catapult inside a window with a little opening and closing drawbridge. And when that opens, you have a limited amount of time to get your projectiles in before they discharge their shot and close back up. These examples of catapults were mostly from Alexander the Great's time, but as siege warfare progressed, catapults got bigger and bigger, so they could be used to destroy fortifications. The problem with this is, it's a lot easier to just pile up more rocks and build your walls taller and thicker to resist the blows from these catapults. A catapult back then used a torsion system, which again I talked about in my catapult video if you want to see that. But these torsion systems were basically the most complex machines of the time. They required specialists who have studied this field and have built them, and were a very expensive commodity. The logistics of building and transporting these catapults caused many generals to put their own troops at risk in order to just try to save the catapults. Going back to Philip II, one of his defeats wasn't really a defeat, was because he sent his troops to a non-advantageous position just to retrieve his siege weapons. This isn't Age of Empires 2, where you can just disassemble your catapult, roll it 3 feet to the right, and then reassemble it all in the course of a second. Lots of men and animals would suffer just to transport these weapons to the battlefield, where they would be used to kill more people. Another siege weapon I want to talk about is a fan favorite, the trebuchet. But surprisingly, the big counterweight trebuchets that everybody knows and loves didn't come around until the 12th century AD. These massive stone hurlers were the most powerful machines prior to gunpowder, and they could be used to destroy walls a lot more effectively. The issue that lies here is accuracy. Every stone you throw is going to be a different weight, different size, different air resistance. So when you fling it, if you don't hit the same spot on the wall, you're just hitting a fully fortified wall in different spots every time you throw. This is another example of why flinging stones over the walls to hit the soft, squishy buildings and people behind them was a lot better strategy. So these siege weapons, these monolithic towers, these giant bolt-casting ballistas, these rock-hurling trebuchets, as cool as they were, the defense could just build a bigger wall, or a second wall, or a castle inside your walls, and you could do nothing about it. These weapons were not powerful enough to actually cause these stones to crumble, and in most cases you didn't want to destroy the walls or the town, because then you had to rebuild everything you destroyed. It's really sad to think about how these great machines were just beaten by piling up more rocks. Pile up more rocks in a nicer way. Build a better wall was easier than actually counteracting these weapons. So Alexander the Great, as said before, would use these siege weapons to reduce the time it took to take a city. Most sieges would last for a year or two, but with being able to get over the walls in a reliable manner, he could shorten this and take multiple cities in a year. Also, if the defenders knew an army had the ability to build these siege weapons, they'd be a lot more likely to surrender than to face your wrath. It really sucks that these machines were more for intimidation or just kind of like flaunt your power and wealth than they were for actually being effective weapons. So to showcase the importance of siege weapons, I want to talk about a few key characters in siege warfare. We already talked about Alexander the Great, but I want to talk about a general who didn't have siege weapons. Everybody has heard the famous story of Hannibal crossing the Alps, but not as many people know what happens once he crossed the Alps. Hannibal killed every Roman army that was sent his way and had Rome quivering in their boots. But the one thing he couldn't beat was a pile of rocks. He could not siege a walled city. Also, the Romans had plenty of logistics to keep their towns supplied with food, and so they could hold out under siege for years and years on end. Hannibal would wander around Italy waiting for something to happen for over a decade. Rome would just poke and prod at him, but never met him in a pitched battle after they were defeated twice. And then Rome decided that they wanted to have a base race strategy. So they sent an army straight to Carthage. This is where one of my favorite characters in history comes in, Scipio Africanus. He sailed directly to Hannibal's home base of Carthage, and Hannibal had to come home because he knew Scipio could build siege weapons and get over the walls of the city. And this is where Scipio finally defeated Hannibal. That's one of my favorite examples of the importance of siege weapons, forcing your opponent to react because they knew you could take their city, and they can't take your city because they don't have siege weapons. Another prime example of this is Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan. There's so many different pronunciations. I'm gonna say Genghis. But this is where Genghis Khan learned this lesson. Genghis Khan would defeat every Chinese army he ran into in his first escapade into China, but he could not take a walled city. He had the wherewithal and the smarts to just imprison Chinese engineers and enlist them in his army so that they could build siege weapons. So when he went to go siege the Middle East, he now had siege weapons and could overcome the walls. Another cool example I like is at the Siege of Alesia, Julius Caesar was fighting Vercingetorix, and he had the town surrounded. Julius's army built 25 miles of wooden ramparts and palisades around the town and their camps. So when Vercingetorix thought he was going to catch Julius Caesar by surprise by sallying forth outside of his walls, all that he met was walls. And since he was defending a city, even though he was attacking Julius Caesar's camp, he didn't have siege weapons to get over those wooden walls. It's almost like Julius Caesar used walls as a siege weapon themselves. That's pretty cool. Another little goofy gadget I want to talk about is this drawing on the whiteboard here. This little hook, it has many names, but one of the names is like the Ravenclaw. The attackers could use it to roll up to the walls and grab the crenellations and pull them off the walls, stripping away the cover the defenders would use against incoming missiles. They could also be used to grab the defenders on the walls and pull them down, letting the physics engine of the game do the work. The defenders would use these as well as little cranes, and they would lower them down and pick up enemy siege weaponry and drop it back down, destroying it obviously, or you could just grab a defender and pick them up onto the walls to be dealt with. These things actually existed. They weren't very effective, but that's funny. So to summarize what we just talked about, in order to take people's land, loot, and labor, you needed to overcome the walls. So if your empire was prosperous enough, you could build these expensive and complex siege weapons to do that a lot more efficiently. Using these siege weapons, you could swing the favor of a siege from the defense to the offense. In kind of a catch-22, since these siege weapons were so difficult and expensive to make, you almost had to use them in order to recuperate the losses of building them. But no matter how impressive of a machine you built, the defenders could just build a bigger wall. They could just build a second wall, they could build a citadel or a castle. If they did this, you would have to do multiple sieges. They would just drag things out longer and longer, cost more of your troops, more of your time, more of your resources. So the best counter to a complex and expensive weapon was to just build a bigger pile of rocks. I'm simplifying it because I think walls are lame compared to siege weapons. They aren't just a pile of rocks. A lot goes into building a quality wall. And the highest quality of walls would be these walls, the Theodosian walls at Constantinople. Look at how tall and brilliant they are. But the problem with building a tall and big wall is it is quite an easy target to hit. And that's where gunpowder would change the face of siege warfare. And that is what we will be talking about in the next video. From 1453, with the fall of Constantinople at the hands of the Ottoman Empire using cannons. But what's your favorite siege weapon? What's your favorite siege? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll get back to you. My favorite siege weapon is the ballista. They got absolutely massive in this time period, and just logistically, they were a nightmare, but they were still used, and I love that. But thank you for watching, and remember, never forget, I need you, yes you, to siege the day. Have a good one.